Welcome to KIMEcast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work. Hey, welcome to KIMEcast. Tony Mikla, Russ Dunning. It's good to be back here with you guys. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the evolving trends in healthcare and how basically we get our information from research and some of these different tools, obviously different AI tools and stuff. I think have been a great way to maybe filter through the research in a faster way. But I want to talk a little about this idea of gaining information, gaining perspective through research. So in healthcare, it's really common for us to get research from scientific journals is kind of always the gold standard. We want peer-reviewed, double-blinded, controlled trials, these things where people don't know what the placebo drug was that they got, but some people got the placebo drug in the control group, and other people got the drug of intervention. Neither one knows which one was active, and then they're studied and tested, right? Mm-hmm. So that makes for a very good scientific controlled study to know that drug have the impact that it should have had on that person, and then they could say, yes, it works, or no, it doesn't. Mm-hmm. So in our world, that's extremely, extremely difficult to do because it's really hard to give one person an exercise, another person get a different exercise or whatever it might be, but something variable that's not the same. And then after a certain period of time, retest the variables and see which one made an impact and which one didn't. So having a control group is very hard if you're going to give them to be a pure control without them just being like ellipsed from the study where they're not able to actually do anything, right?
Right. This is where pure science uses animal studies. So with animal studies, you can say this 100 mice, we're going to do these things, and this 100 mice, we're going to do these things. So how we understand tendons, muscles, mitochondria, how we understand really a lot of basic science in tissue really comes from animal studies because it is pure. Yes, ethically challenging depending on how you treat the mice, but it is more pure to understand a scientific intervention. For instance, Dr. Keith Barr, researcher at Davis, at UC Davis, has given us a world of information about how tendon health works with both tendon compliance and a tendon's jerk, the jerk-like quality of how fast a tendon can react. And all that science really comes from mice studies intensely that he's done for his entire career to understand at a very elite level how tissue changes, how tissue adapts. And then he applies that information to humans with great success. So that's a great example of research done at the animal level that then we apply it to humans with success. Now, how many times can you look at human research? It's hard. Human research is very ugly because we don't fit nicely in categories, and our pathologies or our diagnoses are a bit convoluted because we're human. We're not the same age or the same gender with the same sport with the same diagnosis. It's really hard. So when you look at ACL research, it's like a massive group of people that all had a particular intervention, like an ACL reconstruction, but their makeup and morphology and the shape of their bodies are way different, and the strength that they have and the skill they have. So because this is so messy, it tends to get difficult.
Yeah, now you mentioned that comment there about a massive group of people. It's not really a massive group. There are massive variables amongst a group. Mm-hmm. But the group itself is not that large. So a lot of times in studies around the idea of physical therapy for sure, or healing, maybe in some cases performance as well, you'll see this. But we call it the N number, the number of participants in the study, especially the number that's actually has the intervention that we're assessing, is often very, very low. So usually somewhere around 20 kind of makes up a decent sized study, or what they would consider to be a good study in our space. If you get to like 30 to 50 people participating, that's a really strong study in our world. If you compare that data point to what's respectable in like pharmacology, say you were testing a vaccine as a popular conversation right now, or any other kind of drug, it has to be in the thousands for it to be valuable. And what we've done is we've taken this research and literature, say, hey, if you test 20 people, that tells us enough to be valuable. And I think that we have to look back at that and really, really challenge that data to be like, is that actually good? And is it actually good enough for us to make conclusive claims from that then become part of our standard?
Yeah. Well, and this is typically done in a university, which then has a grant or money to fund the research. And then so you have to ask, how much does the community at large care for the answer in that equation. And when it comes to a drug or a vaccine or a pill intervention that's done within the pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of money that backs that. And to understand back pain, to prevent it, there's not as much money, even though you think there should be. There's no payer for that. And so the institutions, universities that study it, they have a low number size. And the way other researchers get around this is then they do a literature review where they try and combine all these small studies to find themes. Then they grade how good the research was. And then we say out of the 20 studies that all had on average 30 to 50 people in it, these are the things we found. So this is unfortunately what good research is these lit reviews.
Yep. And so like what Russ is saying is like if you were at a college and you're a professor and part of your incentive is to do research, which is really, really common. So in order to do that, you have to do it on a budget. And so the easiest thing for you to do is find a team on campus or a club team on campus is even easier. So many studies are like rugby because it's more of a club sport in the United States. It's really popular in Australia. There's a lot of studies on the rugby population. But you see that a lot. Well, they'll pick a club team of willing people to do a test and do a study. It's really hard to do it for a long period of time because you have to control as many variables as you can. So they usually do it for short windows, like 6 or 8 weeks is kind of the most you'll see. It's very hard to get something much beyond that time frame. And then they'll go work with them. So obviously the groups are usually college-aged men, so men between the ages of 18 and 22, 23 years old. There's usually one team of 20 of them that play some of the same sport. Half of them they put in a control group, half of them they put in the intervention group. And then they assess that at the end, and then they make a claim that, usually the literature or the data suggests X based on the finding. And so it's good. And then you take those claims, and then to Russ's point, if you had 10 researchers studying something similar around the country, around the world, you put together a literature review and say, hey, each of these people had 20 people in their study. Now there's 200 people in the total study, and they're all talking about the same things. And it seems like this data is somewhat conclusive. Mm-hmm. But the problem we have here, and when we look back, so we don't want to take away from what the research is being done. I think it's great. I think it's good. I think it needs to be 1,000 times better. But obviously, we need these things. Otherwise, we don't make any headway. So I don't want to be part of the problem and start to become part of the solution here. But one of the things I think we have to poke holes in is that in our field, especially over the last 40 years, there's been some tremendous claims that based on literature, based on data that comes out in these publications, is the law. And that has continually kind of become misproven. We talked about this, like, it was leapfrogging effect where, for 5 or 10 years we'll be doing something and kind of everybody's doing it. And you get to use this application in the clinic because the research was supposedly pretty strong on it, or there was some good evidence behind it. And then, you get into using it in the clinic, you're like, this doesn't really seem to move the needle. Like, it's not really doing that much. And then you kind of like drop it and then get onto something else. What's the new latest research suggesting? And we kind of see people kind of jumping back and forth, like following this type of a path. And a lot of times we end up disproving something that we thought was pretty concrete at one point by the literature. And then we get in the clinic and use it, and we just don't really see it move the needle. So it kind of dies off.
I was speaking with a researcher several months ago with the attempt to try to understand the research community because as our group, we have around 1,000 athletes, maybe more at this point, where we're regularly testing every few months. And so we have a lot of data capture of, let's call it, 20 different data points for 1,000 different athletes of different ages. And as our data set grows, I wanted to use that for research and think of our physical therapists as researchers in this space. And the lead researcher really kind of grilled me a bit on how we're doing our research. And it came, unfortunately, apparent that we are not using, academic rigor with our research. Meaning, we weren't taking all of the time required in data capture to make sure that the data was perfect. So we were let's say to capture perfect data on a human for what we're looking at, it probably could require an hour and a half to test one human for everything we're looking at. We test it multiple times and we get the average. We make sure they're skilled, they know what to do, that they understand the cue. We had the perfect setup. To really kind of treat it like a university level research, it would take about an hour and a half per person. And when we test an athlete, we're testing them in about 7 minutes. So what do you sacrifice when you take 90 minutes and turn it into 7? You sacrifice the absolute faith that your data capture is perfect. But what does that give you? It gives you impact. We're able to help a lot of people with a 10th of the cost of time. So a private company can do that. We can throw away academic rigor because it's not going to be peer-reviewed science. But instead, we get to really start capturing a lot of data. And then we can understand our community and deploy our own tactics and try and move the needle within our own community at the sacrifice of not being able to say to a journal, this is exactly how the world works. So it's a natural sacrifice. I completely understand. It was after that talk, we're sacrificing academic rigor to maximize our impact on the community. And that's unfortunate how it's in those extremes, but it seems like it.
Yeah, and I would say we're sacrificing academic rigor not only to see what's in the community, but I think to look at something on a more larger scale, I would say there's some truth that we're finding as well. If you have to academically structure a test to the nth degree to gather a piece of data, that's not practical in the real world. That's not what an athlete's going to use in the real world at all. So if we did give coaching advice to a person to do a certain movement, and we did it to 10 different people, and the words were slightly different, but the gist was the same, just like it would be in the real world. If you were coaching lacrosse or you were coaching tennis, hey, hit the ball this way. You might not use exactly the same words, exact same scenario, but you're coaching someone enough to get the desired result. Jump as high as you can, as fast as you can, and that's what we're looking for. Obviously, they do a couple reps, so they get a chance to practice and maximize the number, and then they look at the data and be like, okay, that you could do better than that. And then they usually do another rep, and it's better than that. And then we kind of have that to go off of. But I feel like if we test 1,000 of these people compared to doing it perfectly for 20, there's value in that data as well. And I think that's the challenge. That's what I think we're overlooking sometimes when we're trying to understand human behavior, human movement, injury risk, injury prevention. We look at such small sample sizes that we're not actually seeing enough of a trend across the population. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually what we're looking at. They're not one's better than the other. It's just different. Mm-hmm. And I think just recognizing it's different is what's important. What we should find is that through the literature that we're doing should be that hey, we tested 1,000 people and we found that we identified that we thought these 5% were at risk for an ACL. We followed them over the long path. We figured out that only 1% actually had an injury to their knee during the 1 or 2 or 3 year period. And then it should be a secondary look. It's okay, now we know that there's a strong trend. We see these variables seem to be correlated to this trend. Then we could dive in and try to really find 20 amazing samples that would be the right kind of candidate for the right test, and then do something that's much more academically rigorous to really try to kind of hone and improve it. So I think we're more in this very large pilot study side of things, if you will, as opposed to academic rigor side of things. But what's interesting, the resistance that we come across other clinicians, professionals, et cetera, is they want to poke a lot of holes into it and say, well, what's proven? Or where did you get the idea to do that? Or why would that doesn't seem like you're doing it with the proper jurisdiction, if you will, or the proper rules set in place. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think there's the pretense that all these amazing questions are thought of at the university level, and I feel like what we do is at the ground level. And we see the ground level problems. We see the athlete about to get injured. They have a small injury, and it turns into a really big injury. Or they have a movement issue, and 6 months later they have a different problem, but it's related. We're in the trenches, so to speak. Where I think at the academic university level, they're used to asking big questions, and they're used to asking detailed questions. And then they review the literature. They don't get their hands dirty. They kind of like, what does literature say? How do we think it works? Let's ask. And they kind of live in this intellectual bubble. Whereas we're on the ground floor actually like trying to influence other humans and seeing the difficulty and experiencing difficulty. So I think there needs to be a stronger marriage between the two. I think there's two very, unfortunately, polar groups of people that should be more intertwined.
Absolutely. And I think, when you have this, there's this triangle, if you will, like if you look at evidence-informed or evidence-based practice now is this idea that there's clinical peer-reviewed research, which is kind of at the tip of the pyramid, and it's obviously the gold standard everybody looks to, which I think we should still question that. I think because I've seen us over the years say that, like, yeah, that's exactly the right thing. So, for example, back in the late 90s, everyone was trying to strengthen their VMO, and I still have, we still get physicians writing scripts to like strengthen the VMO, make sure that's stronger. And I don't disagree with that. But we've proven significantly since then that we can't isolate the VMO. So to suggest that the paper that was written in the late 80s and early 90s said isolate the VMO and do these certain exercises to do such a thing because they had 15 people, get stronger, is like, well, we know now, with better research and better studies over the years, that yes, the VMO is critically important, strengthen the quad, all this stuff's really, really important, but you're not going to isolate it. We don't have to talk about the way we talked about it that it was originally taught. Mm-hmm. And the reason why people are still speaking about it now is because they were taught that when they were going through medical school or going through PT school in that late 90s period. So it's just kind of really, really interesting. These things set these types of tones. Another good one would be like knee extensions after like an ACL injury. Mm-hmm. Like I say this to like new grads all the time. If I was to have done a knee extension with resistance on an ACL injury, like when I came out of school in the early 2000s, like let's just say like 2005, 2010, if I'd done a resistant knee extension, I literally might as well have taken my license and handed it back to the board to go into a shredder. Like literally be hung in the streets kind of a deal.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like you would have to be, it would just be
suicide.
Completely, I mean,
career suicide.
Yeah, career suicide. Like, I mean, you'd be done. You'd never get another referral. People talk about you like you're totally nuts, like you're totally off your rock. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're totally crazy, right? And then now it's like, if you're not doing it, you're crazy.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the younger people, as we talk to the newer grads coming out about it, they have no idea this history has existed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so they're running into surgeons who are like, also grew up not doing knee extensions. And now the trend is everybody doing knee extensions. These surgeons are scared to death because the papers used to say that if you're doing knee extensions, you're going to stretch out the graft.
Yep.
So I understand like this dichotomy of information and how there's this polar information. And the problem is that the original studies that were done that are saying as the gold standard in this were done as models. They were mechanical models. They weren't actually testing like strain on the ACL. It's just a model that an engineer wrote up and said, if you put this much torque to the quad, you're going to put this much force to the ACL in theory. And then the other thing that and knee extensions was the highest amount of Newton force on that ACL. Second to or not second, it was first. But behind that were things like squats and lunges were actually much safer. So closed chain things kind of took the cake there. But if you actually look at the numbers, my understanding and recollection here is that in the knee extension, there was like 4 newtons of force would go through the ACL when you did a knee extension. But if you did like a squat or a lunge, 2 newtons of force would go through the ACL.
Yeah.
But yet the ACL is tolerant without stretching at all to like 26 newtons of force.
Yeah.
So it's like, who cares?
Yeah. Exactly.
But the title of the article was, basically knee extensions are dangerous for the ACL and can cause stretch. And because it was the most stressful of all exercises. So everybody said immediately off the list where it's like, yeah, it is the most stressful, but not exactly in a bad way.
Yes.
And now we're seeing it proven 20 years later that actually it's better to strengthen the quad, which also strengthens the VMO, which builds up this strength that's we may have been missing. Maybe that lack of quad strength has been something that's relative to causing to lead to recurrence of ACLs.
Yeah.
So by listening to that gold standard, we may have been shooting ourselves in the foot over the last 20 years, is my point.
Well, I think, to be a part of the solution and be a part of the future, we recently had are developing a great relationship with Sac State physical therapy program, connected with my old colleague, Torrin McLeod. And I'm so excited about this. I know our regional director up in Reno, Nico, is developing a great relationship with UNR in a similar fashion. I think that's exactly the role here, is that universities need to connect more with private companies and be an ambassador of community intelligence. And what does that mean? Well, for a university to be a part of the solution, they need to actually try out solutions and see how to impact the community in a different way. So, because if you just find different studies with, the typical 20-year-old and you're doing something to them, or just asking volunteers, because the other part that colleges do is they'll have, hey, we want volunteers for a study. Who wants to volunteer? I know who volunteers to studies. It's people who live close to a college and are usually quite healthy, and they're actually looking at that, that's like, oh, I want to go into college and remind me of my youthful days where I cared about academics. And these are usually healthy cohorts that join a study at a university in physical therapy or in sports medicine or anywhere close to our industry. Mm-hmm. So it's not it can be a biased group, and the people who don't have as much bias are the ones actually on the ground floor. So to connect the private world to the academic world seems to be really what to do. And that's why we're talking with them. That's why we're connecting, is let's connect, share minds, share thoughts. And I was telling Torrin about our athlete battery, and he was really excited because we're trying to make a difference. And his thought that he said rather quick, I know he didn't mean it this quick, but the thought was, we already know how to save ACLs. And my thought back to him is like, you might know academically, but we're still figuring out how to do it psychologically to a group. And do it psychologically is, what's the right measure that convinces someone they have an issue? Because if you just tell the person, oh, to live a healthier life, you just do all these things, we kind of don't do it. We
definitely don't do it.
Yeah. We kind of need a feedback. That's why Function Health and 100 and all these, Peter Atima's famous and Huberman's famous. These all this massive health 3.0 kick is because of these smart feedback systems that say, by the way, you have a liver issue. By the way, you have a mitochondrial issue. You should have been doing this healthy stuff all along, which we've known for decades. You should be eating good non-processed food. I mean, how debatable is that? But it's not so much that the intervention is not known. It's what's an appropriate feedback that says, oh, by the way, you're on threat of having a back issue because you sat too much, and we can tell because we're giving you this feedback. So it does have a lot to do with psychology of moving the community.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, I think that's the beauty of like the bringing it together. Like if you're a clinician, you're sitting there thinking like, man, I've like seen hundreds of patients or thousands of patients in your career, but you haven't had the time to like write up the case studies or like put them together and gather the data and actually do like a study and submit something and publish it. It's extremely difficult. And you're going against academic institutions who are submitting for their things to get published. It's really, really hard to get published unless you're well connected and you're well in that scope, which is a whole nother commitment to do outside of your actual clinical game. So it's very, very difficult to submit. But this idea of partnering with a university where obviously they have some time and incentivized to do these things, and the clinicians have large patient populations and large loads, it'd be great to like have some common ground there where the professors can help, the students who are assigned to the research project can help, and they can come in and actually start to look at like larger cohorts of real patients and gather data as we hope we can combine with this.
Yeah, because I hope at this point next year we can say both UNR and Sac State are studying firefighters because they have a group of 300 firefighters in the area that are committed to doing some testing, checking in on movement. Are we reducing injuries in this way? Wouldn't that be phenomenal if like university and the private, because being a private company, we're on the ground floor helping people. Like we should be married to these institutions just for the sheer benefit of the world, to raise the global intellect. Because this is what I'd say, I always challenge AI every day of my life. I have like 3 of them that I'm asking, basically the same question. And the movement space, the kinesthetic awareness, the neurological adaptations that come with doing the right thing, this is a very soft art. It's not This is not known. Journals don't know how to move best. Elite coaches might know, but it's not like documented data. It's kind of hard to have a data set that says, oh, that's an elite mover because they're able to do these things. Like maybe if you have a smart high-speed camera and you take a look at the shape someone makes. But my point is understanding someone's nervous system and how they move is very tough science.
Yeah, it is. You have to be able to objectify stuff. So you have to be able to objectify the results, and there's things that you can't objectify very well, like stress has been very, very hard to objectify, whether it be physical stress or other types of emotional or financial stress or whatever, which all weigh in, especially on back pain. And we see it in the clinic every day. But it's also like, how do you measure that? Like, how do you measure what this person is? You look at recovery heart rate, look at max heart rate, look at heart rate variability. There's all kinds of measures that might give you some insight, but still nothing is always concrete. So then, it's hard to do a study on it. Same thing, we know sleep's super important. So you can look at time of sleep, which is, maybe valuable if it's accurate, but it's self-reported. So who knows how accurate it's going to be. And then, when you look at movement, it's hard to objectify movement. How far did that person squat down? Did they squat with some deviations or compensations? It's really hard to objectify that without 3D motion stuff. And then if you're doing that, then now you're in a lab as opposed to doing it like in real play, which we know is very, very different as well. TPI did a great job with that, looking at golfers, looked at a bunch of PGA golfers. They brought them into the lab, had them look at swing everything, swing velocities, ball spins, everything, whatever you see now in TrackMan. They've been doing that with TPI, with Titleist for 20 years, which is an amazing tool. But the reason why TrackMan is really cool now is it's an assessment tool you can take it out to the grass with you, is at least you're starting to get data from being outside at the golf course. Because what they found out in doing this research was that someone swinging in the lab, even at the same guy, so the same pro guy in the lab swinging compared to him swinging on a course, trying to hit a certain shot, are two different swings. Mm-hmm. So as much as we want to take from the lab and say, hey, these are the laws, this is what we know, it's the biomechanical model they create, all that great stuff that we leverage our entire careers on, the reality is when the athlete goes out into the real world, they don't use those models. Mm-hmm. They're actually using something different. So the idea with TrackMan now is they have it out on the live on the course, and they're actually looking at people in live play, and it's obviously tremendous amounts of variation, so it's tough. But the point of all that is it's difficult to gather real good data that you can actually go back and analyze, which slows the process down.
And the best of the best will say, to appropriately kinetically link a run, a jump, a walk, a throw, this is what I'm looking for. But then you have this variability. Then what shape are you? How old are you? Are you really pliable? Are you strong? Are you rooted? Are you more airy? Are you more tendinous? Like the amount of ifs is like, and then at the end of it, you have the best person in the world kind of going by feel. Oh, that looks right.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to quantify, that person's about to get injured for these reasons. And we might have some kinetic leaking breakdowns, but so much depends on like where you're strong at. Where's the connective tissue thick at? Because you've been doing it for 10 years. So it is it's a very soft art that we're in. We try to pretend it's very objectable. We try and say, the quads need to be this strong. You need to squat at this depth. You need to reach here. It's an amazingly soft art to really understand the nervous system. That's what makes humans so, like, all animals, so adaptive.
Yeah, so adaptive. Yeah, and so dynamic. What you did today is not tomorrow. I have this young guy who's a really phenomenal athlete. He's just a young guy. He's only 14, but he's a big kid, really developed, really, really good basketball player. And it's interesting. He come in with like a snapping psoas, so his hip flexor is snapping, and it's become painful for him. But more than anything, it's scary because it makes a pretty loud noise, and sometimes it hurts. So everybody's pretty concerned about it for him. So he's gotten some treatment in the past, and of course they've done massage on the psoas and released it, and then the pain goes away for like 2 days. Amazing, right?
Yeah, massage and stretch.
Yeah, so they've invested a decent amount of money in that. It's like, man, I can't afford that anymore. So they ended up in PT where their insurance is covering it. So I see the guy and and just doing the SFMA and doing the initial evaluation process, I have him do a squat and just a basic squat. And it's like, ooh, like that. This leg. The psoas is not the problem. This is by far the symptom. The right foot is external. The left foot straight ahead, right foot's externally rotated 30 degrees easily. All of the weight is shifted to the right side. At least 80% of the body weight shifted to the right side. The right knee valguses, and he's got some tibial torsion. Like everything's going, and it's like, whew, this is the risk factor. Like if you were to say, what does it look like if I'm going to risk like hurting my knee or hurting myself greater? This is the picture, this is the image, right? And it was just so blatant. It's like, holy moly. But his complaint is a hip flexor. So it's interesting, like having had no one look at the movement quality before, the treatment had always just been soft tissue work, stretch it out, which was very temporary relief. And then sure enough, he goes and plays and it comes back. Well, the hip flexor probably is the only thing that is working in the kid's leg. And so therefore it's tight. Shocker. But it's really hard to objectify those other things. When I can see it really, really quickly because I've been looking at it for years. I know what I'm looking for. But to the average person, you may not see it and you certainly couldn't measure it.
Yes.
And that's what makes it so difficult to get to this point. But it turns out if you look at the mechanical limiting factors for this young man, everything checks out. Like dorsiflexion's there, knee motion's there, hip mobility's there. He's a little tight in extension, but not enough that you get concerned about it. So all of that checks out fine. And if you were to give him all the basic tests, he flourishes, But if you start to take an advantage of look at a single leg squat, try to ask him to do something like a pistol squat, totally bails,
falls apart.
Really falls apart in a hurry. So the in-between test that we've done there is a giant step-up test. So we put him on a massive step-up box where his hips flex at 110 degrees and his heel's basically at his butt, and we ask him to stand up from there. So this kid's he's up there, he's like 6'3", 6'4". So it's a pretty high box. We're on like a 33-inch box. And, on the healthy leg, boom, right up, straight up and down. Bad leg, it's up, can't move. Not getting good glute firing, not getting good contribution from the thigh to get out of that position, and just tough to get out of the hole. He eventually figures it out and still gets it done, which to your point, adaptability, just with like 4 or 5 reps, he kind of got better at that task. But that's we found that to be a great test. And I mean, we can objectify that, but that's...
Well, imagine forming a study around having a research-informed decision about this. This seems like a nightmare. You get looking for the same shape, around same age, same sport, same demands, and then right hip pathology and single leg stance, single leg squat is faulty. The part, what's your N size? You're going to be fishing for that study for a while.
Yeah.
So it's very hard.
If we use pain as the variability, which is the only thing he's complained about, he doesn't have any performance deficit other than the fact that it hurts so he can't go. But we could measure force and strength, and we could see on the force plates there's a deficit there. So that's our only objective. But it's and then the quality of movement, the watching him move, we can see that it looked terrible, and I can see that it's improving pretty good. But I also told him it's going to be 6 or 8 weeks of hard work, like really hard work, to build this leg back up.
Yeah.
Because it turned out too, he'd had about, let's say give or take 10 prior injuries on the leg.
Yeah.
Between an ankle sprain and, some tendinitis of the peroneal tendons, some knee pain, thigh strains, groin strains, and then now snapping psoas, here we are.
Sure.
And it's like all this added up, we never really got the original movement back of the leg, the movement quality back that we needed, and now it just keeps moving around.
You know what I'm so worried about on like a real philosophical level is I think if you'd have looked at that 50 years ago, you would have said, oh, this movement strategy is quite dysfunctional. It's quite abnormal. You have a unique problem. And I'd say like right now, I'd say that's actually an insanely common problem. You have a unique pathology because you're so powerful and you blast away with a lot of grit. So the problem is I think that that particular dysfunction is only becoming increasingly more and more apparent the more sitting we do. The pathology comes out with someone that's that's very powerful, 6'3", powerful person.
You made that, as you said that, man. Another guy. This guy's got back pain, which is obviously the black box of, of America. Is like, so the numbers on back pain is insane. Like 83% of the population will have back pain at some point that disables them for at least a period of time, which is an incredible statistic when you think about effects on the people. I mean, that 83%, that's insane. Anyways, as a young guy, football player, stud of a dude, just beast, probably 6'5", plays like linebacker, defensive end at the collegiate level. And his thigh, strength and just tone of the muscle is D1 level. It's definitely there. It's like, just look at the frame, you're like, this dude's a beast, right? And you look at his back, and his back looks like that of a 16-year-old that really hasn't worked out before.
Oh, wow.
And his complaint is he's had somewhat chronic back pain coming and going here for the last 2 years. And then, of course, you look at the workouts, and the workouts are all power driven, power clean, snatch, broad jumps, plyos, sprinting, etc. And then you just look at the development of the body, and you're like, like I could go back to very basic stuff, like arthrometric measurements. What's the size of the thigh to the size of the trunk ratio? In this case, not good, But that's usually not enough to make the whole claim. You almost have to look at definition of the muscle, which is really hard to articulate. If we MRI'd or ultrasound the muscle and look at depth and thickness and quality of it, that'd probably be our best test here to actually do something objective. But yeah, his treatment strategy, it doesn't have any he's hypermobile, which further documents the problem. He's hypermobile, so he's going to move a lot in his spine, and he's overpowered, so he's a tremendous amount of force on something that's not stable, and just leads to overuse, problems and pain. So we got to stabilize the heck out of his midsection, but we're not going to do that with crunches or planks. There aren't going to be enough to catch up with this guy. So we've heavily dosed him on, the planking, Pallof press, Roman chair, or the boring Sorensen test. We basically did that as an intervention strategy, building up time of duration there. Tons of huge isometric stuff to kind of load that thing up. We do big TikToks, tilted back and forth to get some rotational control in there, which he was terrible at, but could do it, but terrible. But in 2 weeks' time, all that really kind of got nails, and then now he moved to to front squatting with the bar and single arm racked carries, single arm squats with the kettlebell, all that kind of stuff to really increase the load on that trunk in the squat position, so that we can get back to doing cleans and doing squats and doing deadlifts and doing the things he needs to do to continue to get strong to play at the next level in football. But it's been really fun to do that. But once again, gone through a number of treatments that are all, kind of trying to teach him how to stabilize his spine with doing pelvic tilts or, cat-cows and things like that, which aren't bad exercises. But when you're cleaning 350 pounds, that ain't going to get it done.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and then how do you objectify that? How do you,
Yeah.
there's no test, other than a boring Sorensen thing was a great back test. We're really a big fan of that. But the numbers on that are insane. Most people don't even have that in their clinic to be able to do it. For us, it's a paramount item, but a lot of people don't even have that item out there, and they can't even do the test. But if you can get that done, you can really tell a lot about a person's back. But when we're looking at the fire studies, the data on that is 176 seconds to be able to hold your body basically out in a straight line with your feet anchored in, so your back is having to hold your body up. 176 seconds. That's 2.5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's almost 3 minutes.
Yeah.
180 would be 3 minutes. I mean, I've seen people really struggle at a minute.
Yeah.
Some people can't get to a minute. But you think that with 3 minutes the data is that if you get close to that 176, your risk of low back pain is significantly lower.
Yeah.
Well, I believe it.
Yeah.
And that might be the whole 83% thing right there, because that's rare to see someone be able to go for almost 3 minutes on that sucker.
Well, I do think, going back to the research idea, I think that's where research can get it right when they look at a cohort, because at least you're reducing the variables. Because if you looked at the back hold for the general population, you get an office worker paired with a firefighter, paired with a paramedic, paired with a grad student. This could be quite variable, and you wouldn't even know, well, what are the demands of the body? I think when you do research and you are asking a question of a human body, you probably need to have at least a group of I would say like-minded goal, that they have an intent to use their body in this way. Are you measuring a Jeep with a Ferrari, or you have a whole bunch of Jeeps? And what's the best hydraulic system for a whole bunch of Jeeps? And I like it with that perspective. I think the challenge that universities have is, again, they have access to rugby, football, baseball teams, what they actually really need is a group of office workers, a whole bunch of CrossFitters, and a lot of firefighters, because that's the real world, But I tend to be asking this more and more. What do you want to do with this body of yours? So I think it's good to have freedom. It's great to have stability. It's great to have strength. And you probably need elite versions of that, the more elitely you use your body. And so what's the intent? And
I love that study about the Boris Sorensen, for example, not the study, but the several studies that have been done here. It's kind of culminated over the years, and the evidence has got better and better around this. Stu McGill wrote about it, probably not originally, but certainly really put a lot of power behind it. And then it's kind of taken more and more legs. But now you have thousands of people who have gone through this test, which is a very, very simple test. And, you either pass or fail it, and then you study them over long-term periods. That's, I think, where our effort has to be, is like that gives a great guideline because it's easily objectifiable. Can you hold this position for this amount of time? How long can you hold it for? And then you study them over a long period of time, like 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. Did you have a back injury during that period of time? And, then you look at the ratios and you start seeing people who timed lower had higher incidence.
Yep.
That's a great correlation, but it's very general. Like you don't have all of the other comorbidities, all the other factors like baked in because they're baked into the population because you did 1,000 people or 5,000 people. All the comorbidities are baked in. You don't have to you don't have to come down and say like only these people, only this, only this, only this. And then we have this piece of data that we think we can extrapolate to everybody else again. It's like, I don't know about that.
Well, I do think, of the research studies I've read, sometimes I just jump right to the discussion because it's less about what was the clear objective. I'm actually more curious, what was the intent of the researcher? What were you trying to answer? But you couldn't ask the real question in your research study because the peer review group was just going to eat you alive. But in discussion, you get to say, here's what I think. And I've started to actually value that more. But what do you think? And for instance, if we're going to have a study of firefighters look at the Boris Sorensen test, we're going to do long holds. We're going to see the prevalence of low back injuries over the next year after looking at this. All you're going to do is say, here's the data. But in the discussion, you're going to talk about mitochondria. You're going to talk about the definition of stability stamina. You're going to say, I think that the people can only hold for 30 seconds, but have a certain amount of strength in their back. They might have neurological strength, but they lack mitochondrial density. And the people that have decent neurological strength, i.e. a deadlift or Romanian deadlift, some type of back movement strength test, but that can hold for 3 minutes, they have phenomenal slow twitch development. They have phenomenal mitochondrial density. So then we get to think it's actually the mitochondrial capacity, the mitochondrial density that actually is the key indicator of whether or not someone's getting injured, at least in the low back, because that's a stabilizing tissue. And I like to think of it like that because that helps the clinician think. When I have someone with a problem in front of me, am I going to be an influence of stamina on their life? Am I going to be an influence of neurological stability in their life? Am I going to be an influence of establishing freedom, reducing threat, and improving hip internal rotation movement? We need a little bit of a theme. So, that's our homework. That's our corrective strategy. That's like the major influence of like, this is your big rock to move. And to that, I do enjoy reading a little more of the discussive parts of every research. Like, tell me what you think. What's your aim? What are you trying to answer? Knowing that you're not going to answer it perfectly unless you're taking muscle biopsies, which is kind of hard to do for
Again, in the human, certainly in America, it's almost impossible. We get some recent studies out of Europe where they're looking at that kind of depth. But I think that's a great point. That it is good if you can get into the discussions. How are you using AI nowadays to kind of filter through research and maybe get to that point where like, well, that's an interesting point, and then be able to kind of pick things you want to read a little bit more about? Because I think we've used AI really effectively so far. I really, really enjoyed it and the ability to kind of like filter through the research or filter through the data rather quickly as opposed to having to read cover to cover, however many articles, 10 articles a month or something. I mean, you can take those and like really get a summary, whether or not you trust it completely. How have you found that to be?
I've asked 2 questions of AI that I could never have looked into a textbook or even asked a professor. I asked 2 questions that really kind of shaped how I thought. One, I asked, what's the hormonal variation of kids and what's the hormonal variation of adults by gender, by sex? And that's a very complicated question. Like I'm really asking, what's the multiple of variance? How bad can someone be and how elite can someone be from a hormonal standpoint? And then same question from a mitochondrial density standpoint. And the mitochondrial question can be answered a little more with numbers. So you can have a cell with as low as 100 mitochondrial organelles for not a great adaptive cell. Doesn't have a good aerobic cell for that person, 100. And an elite would be 2,000. So that's like a 20x. So that means you give the same exercise to 20 different people, and you'll have a 1x adapter and a 20x adapter. That means, so you take that in combination with hormonal variance, that means there's no such thing as a good program or a bad program. Are you applying the right dose program to the right person? That, to me, knowing that throws away all programming advice ever where it says, do this set number for this people. Because all it is a game of averages.
Yep.
They're saying for the middle third of people, this will work. It doesn't at all speak to the lower, and it doesn't at all speak to the elite. We're just saying in the middle, most people adapt to this. That's what research shows, is pretending everyone is average. In reality, we have a massive variance.
Yeah, that's why there's so much program debate, I think, where everybody's like got the newest thing and you got to do this program for this and then you got to do this program for that, as if, and none of them talk about like the customer or the end user. They just say, oh, this program's really great for this. Where the conversation is probably more around, this program's really great for this kind of adapter.
Yes.
Which is what an elite coach is doing and thinking about. But a lot of times we see that debate, like, oh, I got to change the program up just to change it up. Not really.
Yeah. That's all full of it. Yeah. So I think asking AI these difficult questions and then saying, why do you think that? Give me the research that points to that. And it is, what are the main ways we adapt? I mean, hormones, nervous system, the organelle of aerobic capacity, like those are big ticket items of, if you do a said activity, does someone get better from it? Regardless of that, doesn't even talk about the dysfunction question. It just talks about, even if you nailed the dysfunction, this is exactly what we think might work, how much and how often should you do it? It's incredible variance. My point in saying that is I'm using AI on these big questions, and I have it being my research assistant to kind of like give me a little perspective.
Yeah. And then you can go and dive deep. I know that you were talking the other day about looking at somebody's force plate information work and going back and then reading some of the previous content that had been researched by that individual and gave you a perspective of like where he's coming from and narrowed it down to what cohort he was working with compared to what cohort maybe we see in the clinic.
Right. We were looking at looking at someone's jump, looking at someone's strength. And when looking at someone's strength, is it in a low position or a high position? Is it with the use of their hands, like an isometric mid-thigh pull, or say in a different position where you're only using like a belt squat? So this is part of our athlete battery, where we've tested some people with what's traditionally called an isometric mid-thigh pull on a force platform. So that means you grab a barbell and you're putting it at the mid-thigh, and you do kind of the initiation of a deadlift. It's like a deadlift pattern where you're hinging your body, you're pulling up, you're not moving because it's an isometric test. And you're seeing how strong someone is in that high pull position, which is a very important position in the college weight room, where they'll do hang cleans, power cleans, snatches of the sort, and you make that pattern. So it's very important for college sport programming and to some degree high school programming. Versus something we've kind of pivoted to as a company of doing a belted version. So we put a belt on someone, we connect the chain to the force platform, and then we can change the angles. We can put the knee angle at, say, 90 degrees. We can put the knee angle at 120 degrees. So bias a low position and bias a high position. And there's a lot of assumptions that you're doing. If you do this test enough, you'll see if someone does an isometric mid-thigh pull, or they do a high belt squat or a low belt squat, they all make different shapes. They all sometimes curve their spine, sometimes hyperextend their spine, sometimes they love a very forward shin angle, sometimes they don't. They're all trying to find their strongest position, which is like a question of itself. So we're doing like the same test on a lot of people, and we're seeing different shapes they make. And then we're trying to answer, what is a strong position? What is appropriately strong? Across both sexes, where notoriously the female athlete or the female person is going to have typically smaller shoulders, which also equates to smaller hands, which then equates to a lesser grip per body weight. So, we have these like component of sexual differences, and then we have a lot of shapes that people make, and we're all trying to quantify a game of averages. And it's not good enough in research to say it all depends, because then you wind up saying nothing at all. So you get confused. You get down a rabbit hole, like, what are we even looking at anymore?
So as an example in this, in mid-thigh pull, a lot of the standardization is built around doing a mid-thigh pull, and there's standard numbers for both men and women and such. But the challenging point for you is that women, is more predominant than men, that the limiting factor is grip.
Mm-hmm.
The size of the handles massively varies for them, as well as like how much they can hold and how much volume they can do with it. So going to the belt squat eliminates that limiting factor.
Yes.
And now we're going to exclusively looking at least at the hips and at the leg force production, which is really what we're thinking we're after.
We think we're after.
Now, if you're after total body force production, and then mid-thigh pull might be the appropriate thing for you.
It is what it is.
Yeah, if you don't care and you're saying, well, I want to know if this person's going to, how much they can power clean, I'm looking for that correlation, well, then mid-thigh pull makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at an athlete for like, how high are they going to jump to get a rebound, how much force can they produce to decrease risk of knee injury, of limited ankle sprains, of sprinting faster, then their grip strength has very little to do with those movements specifically. So maybe a belt squat is actually going to be a more pure metric that has less variability to it, because it's really isolating what can you do from your trunk down with using the legs. Now, you still have to have balance. You still have to have some trunk control. You still have to have a lot of awareness, proprioception. Like all those things are still included, so it's still very athletic movement. It's probably harder to do actually than the mid-thigh pull when you get in the position. All people kind of are trying to get set and then be able to find a way to push.
It is, and that does speak to the skill of the test. And I think where people kind of get a little funky is the isometric mid-thigh pull. Some people will round their back, and their knee is a little straighter than you wanted. The back's rounded, and you're kind of like, what am I testing here? And then in the belt position, they have a hard time pushing correctly down. They want to push almost in front of them, which drives them backwards. And so you get these positional difficulties where people have to learn how to do the test, which is also teaching them how to learn how to move. So there is a lot going on, and I think you always have a sway. What are we trying to solve to? Which would be any research would say, what are you after? And we're trying to answer the question: is the athlete strong enough to not get hurt? Which is perhaps a little different than I want to know how to program them. I want to know what weight they should do. I want to know, are they ready for Olympic lifting power program? So I think you could probably ask a lot of different questions. And if one question was, I want to see if you're about to hurt yourself. Can I get you in a difficult position and see how strong you are and extrapolate risk accordingly? So it kind of depends on which side of the coin are you on. And watching enough athletes move, sometimes I feel we should just get out of their way and let them go, just help them, protect them from themselves. So sometimes I like the protective aspect. Let the athlete be the athlete and try to see if we can help them not get injured, and just with consistency, they'll grow. Another aspect, I do love performance. Can we enhance your jump if we do these things? So I'd love to say we're doing one thing at the same time. We're doing two things at the same time. We're improving their health and improving their performance. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Well, that's what we found to be true for years, right? I mean, oddly enough, if you move better, both of those things go up. Yeah, your performance goes up, your injury risk goes down. We've certainly seen those trends in daily work as well as in the literature over the years. So I think it's great. So, I mean, take home points is, just don't believe everything you read at first glance from a literature standpoint. Look at where it's coming from. Look at what the sample size was that they looked at in those studies before you make conclusive ideas, and definitely look at trending data. I think we need to make movements towards a larger group, larger studies. In some cases, we've done a great job with it in our field. I like that. We were talking about the Barris-Sorensen. It was a good example of that. But in other cases, we've still missed the mark and studied small groups and tried to take that and apply it to large groups. And I think that we've shot ourselves in the foot a few times there. But that's also how we learn. When it did go to large groups, the clinicians were kind of like, it's not really moving the needle, with a couple of examples of that. But we've seen that over and over again, where we see the field just kind of keep changing on what is it, what's good, what's bad, what's best practice. It's a little bit gray out there, and I think that's one of the reasons it's not so clear.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to KIMEcast. Check us out online. If you guys are already watching, feel free to throw in the comments, and I'd love to hear your take on this. What research have you read? What do you think about this? How do you think the field can go as far as contributing more so that we can get where we need to go faster and more effectively for the communities we serve?